Hello, you're listening to a new podcast about buildings and cities. I'm Luke Jones.
And I'm George Gingell.
And this is our first proper episode.
Mark 3.
Mark 3. Congratulations, George.
Well, I feel this congratulations could possibly be a little premature, but let's go for it.
Yeah, let's go for it. And where else could we begin our first episode but at home in England? We're going to talk to you about a book called The English House by Hermann Muthesius, which is a book from the start of the 20th century. It's a book which aims to give a full, very comprehensive account of the English way of living, the relationship of the English culture to English ways of living, the English climate, English behaviour, and a exhaustive list of all of the features and elements of the English house. So this is our bid to go mainstream from the beginning.
Yeah, we thought, even if this perhaps isn't the most popular book now, once we've talked about it, it will be flying off. It will escalate from being the 2 millionth most popular English language book on Amazon to perhaps being only the millionth. Yeah. There are a few reasons why it's not popular. It deals with just about the most unfashionable thing, which is rich, sort of semi-mock Tudor looking houses of the late 19th century.
It's things which in England you're legally not allowed to like until you are over 75.
Oh, I think you can be 50 as long as you're a member of a fringe right-wing political party.
Okay, yes.
And the other thing that's slightly off-putting about it is it's longer than the Bible. It's like a whole encyclopedia. It breaks. So there's a sort of bit about it feels necessary to set the ground by doing a 400-page history of England.
Yes.
With respect, going from sort of the beginning, the mists of time. He has brief discussions of architecture, and then he's straight into the nitty-gritty of dado rails, the particularities of each room corner, whole chapters on different types of Edwardian or Georgian or Jacobean ceilings, the advantages of making them out of wood pulps as opposed to plaster. Every sort of nook and cranny of the garden is dealt with in encyclopedic detail.
Inglenooks.
Oh, yes. Not inglenooks, but the inglenook, in inverted commas, because we're reading this. This is written only to be in German, translated after his death.
Yes.
A long time after his death.
A long time after. He went under a tram, like a number of other architects of note. It's a favoured.
Seems to strike the Germans, actually.
Strikes the Germans. Yeah, and Gaudi as well.
Yeah. Continentals,
yes. No, we got rid of all of our trams. Our architects are safe.
Well, Siebold, he was German, but he died of a car crash in England.
Yeah. Coincidence?
I think not.
And we're laying our cards on the table at this point and saying that we are fans of this book.
We love him. I mean, he's got some slightly funny ideas.
Yeah. But it's completely, I've written down here, completely ridiculous, completely fascinating, occasionally insightful. Not just what he observes, but the way he records it.
Yeah, this 900-page long dense German book is a barrel of laughs.
It's actually very funny, and and he is actually quite an ironic writer. And when we get on to talking about how he talks about the English, there's a great deal of fondness and deadpan mockery. George, give us a quick picture of Muthesius' life.
So he's born son of a successful builder. He's obviously a man of enterprise. Quite a young age, he got a job in a building firm, went out to Tokyo, worked in Japan. It was this 1880s when Japan was hiring all sorts of Western engineers and stuff to build up their economy. Then comes back, builds a couple of churches and a few small projects, and then very quickly gets a job as a cultural and technical attaché in the London Embassy. So he was supposedly sort of reporting on gasworks and battleships and railways, and the English ways.
The English ways, yes.
English culture.
Which, this is sort of a time when I think partly Germany's super fascinated by England because it slightly identifies it as being a little bit ahead of it in industrial terms, or had done until recently. And then also is thinking about it as a quite likely antagonist in a big war.
there's other things. I think it's worth saying that who he's dealing with. So what he's doing is this technical attaché is he's meeting loads of really important people, and they're having him over for dinner. Yeah. Really rich people. So he's the captains of industry. He's being taken over to dinner. Maybe he'll see their hydroelectric plants, and they'll chat about that. But mainly just sort of fun, entertaining with plutocrats.
Yeah. And who does he think he's writing for? What's the audience?
Well, I have to say, when I was first looking at this was a bit of a mystery.
Yeah.
Who is this book for?
Because it's in Germany, it was incredibly successful. It sold like very large. It went through a lot of printings very, very fast.
Yeah, it's interesting. Rather like sort of Engelbert Humperdinck keeping the Beatles off the #1 spot. All the stuff that we talk about from Germany at this time, which is the burgeoning avant-gardists.
Yeah.
Nobody really cared. What they were interested in was the English house.
Yes.
Particularly its mock Tudor detailing and free plan and all
Yes.
that lovely stuff. And yeah,
Yes.
it did really
Yes.
well. But it's not it's like quite a... I mean, it's easy to read and it's well written. But it's a doorstop, and it's a sort of terrifying subject.
Well, it's good if you have a lot of space on the bookshelf to fill. I mean, so I'm thinking that there are architects reading it, and they're definitely...
For sure, but it's broader than that, isn't it?
It's
enlightened intelligentsia,
Yeah.
and people who want to be like that. And it's probably... Do you think it's a bit like one of those posh travel mags? Do you think it's a bit aspirational?
It was... is it monocle? Is it?
Yeah.
I think it might be a bit
what's
monocle.
the one with the silly name? Sort of a bit Nespresso capsules and how to spend it in the Financial Times.
Yeah. There's certainly like an agenda which this comes out of, which is his feeling that domestic architecture in Germany is a bit crap. Like, it's a bit vulgar, pretentious. It's not... What he likes about English architecture is that he identifies like a very strong Englishness about it.
It's cosy.
Yeah.
It's confident.
Yeah. But it's distinctive, and he can see how it arises out of like... I think what he sees as confident about it is that it arises out of the culture and what people want, rather than seeking to ape something which is fashionable from somewhere else. And I think he thinks that German houses look a bit French or look a bit kind of Italian, but not necessarily because people really like that, but just because they feel like that's what a house should look like.
I think kind of in the way that people would complain about minimalist interior design now as being naff, pretentious and horrible to live in, but loads of people go for it.
It's okay.
It's fine. But I think it is. But like, classicism is fine.
Yeah,
nothing wrong with classicism either.
The
stuff he's complaining about is fine, but it can be really naff.
The thing with minimalism is you have to put the children in a cupboard. You have to have
slotted drawer.
Slotted drawer. Yes. Well, we've got off track as expected. Yeah. Let's talk about the kind of architecture that he liked.
Yeah, that's a good thing. He likes this what he calls this thing called free building, as opposed to architecture, and it's breaking away, but in a very gentle way, from the past and all the strictures that he sees as being so destructive on the continent. Yeah. And the sort of thing they're breaking away from is, firstly, obviously, classicism, all this obsession with proportion and rectangular windows and Greek pediments and columns and stucco and putti angels and things.
Yeah, like the houses of before this, they have columns on the front, they're white.
And even if you live in an expensive block of flats in Germany, it's trying to be like, a duke's house. But it's also other things. It's breaking away from, like, they can be much more playful in the plan. Things are often at angles. There's all sorts... And also in the section, levels get broken up. It's sort of starting to go in that direction. Yeah. And... it's all about, whereas the classical order is all about your eye centers on a place, you're guided, it's still and ordered. Free building's all chaotic. It's all about the eye being drawn all over the place, not having anywhere to rest. There's a little funny nook there, turret here.
Maybe more dynamic than chaotic, but it's certainly clear that rather than...
Oh yeah, it's really carefully...
Yeah.
It's carefully tousled hair. It's sort of,
It's something which is meant to be experienced through kind of walking in and around it. There's never like a fixed point which is the proper place to see it from.
Yeah, I mean, kind of there are. Like, they have particularly focused things. But the idea is that It's not dictating to you.
Yeah.
It's not saying...
I mean, you say that it's, in one sense, it's breaking away from history, but in another sense, it's also profoundly informed by history, but trying to do it in a different way. So that they break away from a kind of orthodox relationship to history, and instead they try to, for instance, draw on local vernacular traditions as they see them, or to kind of mix and match different historical or material traditions.
Yeah, it's really unpedantic. It's like Heatley doesn't care at all what you slap together. You know, mix up all the styles.
Yeah,
use
it's
them
eclectic.
as tools, but
Yeah, there's a bunch of other sort of labels which people would apply to some of the styles that Muthesius is talking about, like arts and crafts, Queen Anne, or possibly Gothic revival. But we're kind of talking about them all as the same thing, and also slightly none of them.
the people who like this stuff now tend to be... I once went on an amazing trip. This can probably be edited out, but we went with the Pugin Society to Alton Towers.
Oh, right.
Because Alton Towers, in the middle of the theme park, there's this huge country mansion which was designed by Pugin. It's like one of his biggest projects, apart from the Palace of Westminster. So you've got all this sort of riot of broad gauge corduroy, sort of colourful scarves and indefensible opinions. We all went on Hex because it's inside the house. It was very good. It was very good. It was a lovely moment.
Let's talk about a specific example, which is the house that we both went to visit. It's the Red House, which is the house built by Philip Webb for William Morris in Bexley Heath.
This building's really early. It's the earliest building that he gives us as an example. It's done for the young William Morris, and he's like striking out. The Gothic revival had been going on for a while. Houses of Parliament very much underway. But they're sort of going off in a slightly different tangent. It's way out in the suburbs.
So because of its size, all the effects are very simple. The plan is irregularly L-shaped, which means that from every side, the apparent mass of the building is different. So it's in a walled garden, and as you walk around it, the amount of it that you see as you walk around it just changes from every angle. It's also broken up in terms of the mass by these big, tall chimneys, which are really oversized, actually, and kind of break up the roof line and the sort of apparent volumes that it's made up of. And there are also kind of gables pointing in different directions, so that all the larger elements are broken up by smaller ones.
There's other funny things. So you've got this complicated massing, but on the exterior, it's really bare. The only thing you see are the windows, which form complicated patterns and clusters. And really, what it's saying on the outside is, I'm just going to allude a little bit to what's inside. You know, there's a pattern of 3 circular windows, but there's no decoration. It's completely flat. And in fact, in the old pictures of it, it was completely covered in plants, in vines.
And the only thing which is expressed are these like kind of flush arches, but in fact which you don't even really see.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of like, they liked craft. They were really getting into craft, which I think will be a theme going through this whole thing. So there's a lot of like brick craftiness. Yeah. Like the chimneys are sort of gorgeous in the way they slightly taper in and take on these, and there's this sort of funny little, it's not an inglenook, but it's like a little seat popping out of the wall with lots and lots of... They like detail.
I think for me, I also detect like slightly the attitude of iconoclasm creeping in there. Maybe this is entirely a projection, but this is consciously an iconoclastic project. It's meant to be against something, and I think that making something which has this like real plainness and real like, I don't want to say necessarily in your faceness, but there is something about it where it's like, that's it. Like, that's what it is.
Yeah, it's really austere. It's sort of, it's a bit aggressive.
Yeah, I think that there is a kind of suppressed or like a passive aggression.
He's a young guy.
Yeah.
He's a young guy. He's got some strong opinions.
Yes.
And he doesn't mind if everyone knows it.
Yeah.
Before we go into the house, I'd like to expand outwards.
Yes.
I think an under-discussed element of free building is the relationship with the buildings to the landscape. I think that's important. So where it was a little bit built up, but handily, he's got a massive garden which he has a massive wall around, which is trying to be medieval. It's like a sort of monastery garden. And it's laid out in exactly the way that Hermann likes, which is formal and with native plants, and it's a bit mock medieval. There's a number of serving outbuildings in the garden, which he obviously lavished a bit of care and attention on. There's a number of there's a couple of sort of basically sheds, but they feel very much like they're very informed by the vernacular. And then as you get up to the building, there are a couple of little elements that break up the mass. It's trying to, again, be very unlike this box classical villa.
And then these medieval illusions on the inside become like very, very much stronger and more explicit.
Yeah, the inside is taking after a lot of the... it's sort of taking where the Gothic revival stopped and really getting into this world of tapestries and carved wooden panelling and painted glass and elaborate tiles and fancy ceilings and beautiful carved furniture.
So, like a couple of examples, there's this big, very high space above the stairwell, the roof of which is very richly painted with this like blue and white sort of wave-like motif. The insides of all the doors are also very richly painted. Like in terms of the colour, they're very richly painted.
At the moment, it's worth saying the current condition is a bit sad. It's had all the stuff nicked and all the paintings painted over. Well, when I say nick, I mean probably flogged off for silver sixpence to a passing friend from across the pond, or perhaps taken home by a colonel or something.
Yeah, there are bits. I think you can get a sense of what it was like. There's this sort of funny painting that they're unearthing in the dressing room, which has lots and lots of medieval scenes.
Yeah, and there's little bits of tapestry as well. They had like a couple of little bits and bobs. Yeah. And it's quite informed by medieval painting. I mean, I think they've probably been to old churches, and they've got this thing of like there's both figurative stuff, but also lots of that like rich geometric patterning.
Yeah, there's painted glass as well, where they have these, I think, deliberately quite sort of crude bird motifs.
Also, because they were sort of doing it themselves a bit.
Also, it's all in like appropriate brown. There's a definite like fetishization of mud colours.
Fetishization of both the like russet, dun colours that are prized among the peasantry, and also the aesthetic of really faded tapestries and really faded paintings where everything has gone brown.
But so alongside all of this kind of historical illusion, pastiche and play, there is something about the house which is very distinctively modern, which is the way in which the rooms are arranged and the circulation through it.
There's an amazing thing about this house, which is that although in scale, I mean, it's a large house, but it's not massive. It's like a large family house.
Yeah, it's not at the scale of like a stately home, which most of the houses which Muthesius is talking about are.
Is that it arrives on the scene right at the beginning with not all of the tropes fully formed, but with a lot of the language that's going to become free building already there.
Yeah. So you have these corridors. Well, is the corridor the right word? I think it is, actually, isn't it?
Well, I think an informed idea of what the corridor is, they're sort of reaching back for these medieval precedents.
Yeah, so let's call it, maybe it's better to call them galleries. These sort of circulation spaces which on one side have windows and on the other side have kind of rooms opening up out of them. But they're scaled in a way which is not like a pure circulation space. They're much more wide, and they're designed as sort of spaces to linger in, and also spaces within which to sort of take in views inside the building. There's a very characteristic view that you get at the top of the stairway, which is this square stair which kind of goes up the sides of this very tall hall space, where you can look across the stair diagonally through a sort of really oversized kind of almost monumental brick arch, which is sort of also has been overscaled so that it gets cut off where it touches the wall. And over that side there are some little stairs going up into a little passage, which is where the children are. Or you can look kind of straight over the stair where are these windows going out into the garden. You can see a bit of the well and also some other bits of the house, but in a quite fragmentary way. Or you can look to your left and see the openings into the studio.
Yeah, where he's working, which eventually is sort of the idea. The way the house works is there's a central hall with a staircase, and off that are lots of smaller circulatory spaces, which are often really nice. They've got like lovely windows and lovely things, and then the rooms are off that. And the architectural play of the interior is all about when you either come in. So you come in and you come into a hall before the hall, and then you can see through all this lovely elaborate stuff and all these levels and landings and interstitial bits. Or if you're going from dining room to drawing room to bedroom to the man's room, all these different, sort of let's retire to the library type stuff, you get all these lovely movings around. And you could sort of meet people, I imagine, in the hall and say...
Yeah, and it's critical.
Ahoy!
And it's critical that you often can see just around a corner, but you can't see like right down a corridor. It's different in that way. You get so from the ground floor you see.
It's all about glimpses.
Yeah, glimpses. You see the stair kind of going up and disappearing, but you don't actually. All of the real action is happening above your head, and you can't see it from where you are. Or when you see down a passageway, you see a little stair going up into it and some light coming in from another window and a sort of indication that there's another world happening in there. But you would never get, as you would in a classical building, the view going all the way down the corridor and seeing everything.
Yeah, or they wouldn't even have a corridor. It would be down an enfilade it would be down this... Sorry, I'll unpack that phrase a bit. You get a room, and then there's a big door, and then there's another room, and then there's a big door in the same place, and another room, and you look right down this set of rooms, and that's the whole sort of language of power and authority and intimacy and things. It's also worth noting again that this doesn't just extend to like between corridors, but also I think there's a lot of important glimpses of the building and the landscape and the world outside. But again, they're not direct. They're indirect views to bits of like a bit of a roof plane and a little bit of garden, and there's a lot of places where you could sort of see someone walking in the distance. Someone's coming into the house. You get a glimpse, but you don't have a commanding panorama at any point.
So this is as we've said, this is the early example, but within actually 10 years of this, the people with the real money are also building these houses, and they're building them on a massive scale. And they're building them with like way more effect, way more kind of drama. So there's a couple of examples. If you were to look at Lees Wood or Cragside, photos of which we'll put on the website, which are both country houses designed by Richard Norman Shaw,
who incidentally is Muthesius' absolute favourite,
and who had worked with Webb at some point. I think they worked in the same office together when they were young or when they were training or something like that.
Neither of them are terribly old at this point.
No. And I think also to talk about these houses, you get like a fairly typical view of what a client is. So the client for Cragside is a guy called William Armstrong, who made a lot of money selling arms. And
he made a really good rifle breech loading cannon. He'd sort of played around with an incidental thing before we talk about the thing he was most proud of with the building was that it was the first building powered entirely by hydroelectricity.
Oh yeah, well I think that is something to be proud of.
There wasn't an electrical grid, but he built his own electrical grid for the house based on a complicated hydro system.
Yeah, well he did well. But then to finish the story, so he gets all the money, he builds himself the house, and then like the house fulfills its purpose because he's made a lord.
Yeah, he's got like a really like swank place, and he can have all the dinner parties and everyone go, oh, this man is lovely. Yeah. Invite me back, and he can do all his socialising and politicking, and then he sort of goes off and becomes quite political and gets advancement.
So that's kind of the story, is that these are a minority of them are actually built by aristocrats. I think one of Webb's biggest commissions was, but most of them are people who've manufactured loads of stuff, who've made lots and lots of money in a time of...
or run hotel chains or shopping chains, or are very good at buying or like tramp steamers or something. Yeah. Modern money, modern ways of making money, corporations. they've got corporations.
So the design of this house doesn't introduce that many new formal ideas. In fact, those are all really there in the red house, but it's massively more complex and intense, and the style is more eclectic. There's really a mix of styles.
Yeah, the red house is knowingly Gothic revival.
Yeah.
But that's the end of it. After then, they're almost all going to be in this mixed eclectic style.
So if we look at Lee's Wood, the main body of the house is these big monumental stone elements, often with actually quite few windows in many places, and like these big areas of blank wall, sort of castle-like. But there are also big Tudor half-timber towers. There are sort of ribbon windows. There are kind of these medieval motifs, but which are sort of highly distorted and made much too big or much too small. And there are like consciously sort of dramatic effects which are created. So you'll have a big blank area of masonry with a single door or a single window into it.
This complexity is really great, and also, again, the way it sits in a landscape, although this one is in a sort of much more steroidal, craggy, cliffside location. And something you do get here more than you got with the Red House is this notion of sort of vernacular accretion. Like, there's bits that are a little bit Queen Anne-y, bits that are very Tudory or really medieval.
So this is that there is a conscious attempt, not absolutely to fake it, but to suggest something which has grown over time in different elements.
As you say, it's not that you're meant to see it as different bits. It's that subconsciously you're meant to have the idea that there are lots of elements coming together in this exciting collage, rather than, again, we're really taking a hammer to the classical order.
Yeah. So when you look at the plan, the first thing which is very, very obvious is that no two rooms are the same size anywhere in the plan, and I think possibly even not from floor to floor. I think they may all be different sizes, and you can kind of see that in the plan, but you also in the section they'll all mostly be quite different heights, or there'll certainly be a lot of variation in heights between them.
There's level changes throughout the section. Also with the staircases, nothing just goes straight up. They all go up and then wrap round, or go up and stop, or go up, have a landing, move down a corridor and go up.
Yeah, the circulation takes a kind of a journey around the building.
It's like a really extended version of the Red House, where it delights in the views through and the glimpses.
And the rooms are in the rooms are in a kind of conversational arrangement with each other, so that they very rarely are they all like lined up next to each other, but they're often like a corner of one will lead into the opposite corner of another, or that one will sort of be nestled behind another. And it means that they all have very different outlooks, that they have like quite different. Some of them will feel very exposed to the landscapes, and others will feel like very protected, very kind of nestled into the mass of the building. And of course, like all the windows are different, so the sort of light conditions are very very varied. The other thing which is a bit misleading is that it looks absolutely massive and like vastly intricate, but in fact almost all of the plan is for servants.
Yeah, and coach houses and sculleries and coal holes and huge amounts of area given over to like the preparation of food for guests, and sort of things where you think a bit like, oh, I wonder what I could put in this massive turret I've built. Yeah. More servants. Can never have enough servants.
Put more servants in. Yeah. It means that if you actually examine it, there are very few. For a house of its size, there are like 4 or 5 bedrooms.
that are not for servants.
Yeah.
There are lots of bedrooms for servants.
Yeah. It's very... I think that there's the other thing to stress is that, which you don't get either from the plan or for any of these perspectives, is the level of detail. So these houses are absolutely full of like incredibly intricate detail in wood, the balustrades, the stonework, the decorative metal, the fireplaces. One of the things which he comments on is that you have to have a fireplace in every English room, and they're all different, and they're all very, very specific.
People would spend masses of money on them. The amount of money that was going into this stuff is incredible, and had been for a long time.
Yeah, it's a moment when it was obviously possible there were obviously some really great craftsmen around at that point, loads and loads of people who could work wood, work stone, work metal really beautifully. And it's also a time when an architect working on this kind of commission would really go out of their way to design everything down to the smallest thing that they possibly could. They would have sketches, they would have kind of elevations of all sorts of elements, every stone if they could.
But yeah, the reason why Muthesius can spend a whole chapter talking about ceilings is because there's just a hell of a lot of design that goes into ceiling decoration, as an example of the sort of thing that goes into every form of decoration. Now that we've got some idea of what Hermann's talking about in terms of the building style, we can start to talk a little bit more about the book, yes. Which I think is a good way into the mindset. And Hermann being a very organised... The whole book is very organised, isn't it?
It's highly, highly organised.
It's very encyclopedic and taxonomical.
Yeah. One of the things we've discussed is that this is an era when butterflies were not safe from people trying to pin them in orderly rows.
Yeah, in a non-serial killer kind of way, he's doing what the obsessive beetle studier does to the beetle to the English upper middle classes. He is examining their sort of species, homes, environments, habitats, and the way they deport and disport themselves.
Yeah, so I mean, there's all kinds of lists. There's like lists of rooms and their uses, lists of finishes, lists of objects and types of furniture.
Should we give some examples from the?
It's a book which you can tell a lot about by reading its contents page. So you can do the introduction.
Introduction: the individuality of the English as a result of the country being an island, living in private houses, the preference for living in the country, the proverbial love of home, the names of houses, the Englishman's sense of independence. One of the reasons for living in a house. Climatic influences. The beauty of nature in England. Urban living. The advantages of living in a private house. Living in a private house is necessary to artistic culture. Influence the way of life of the English culture. Restricted access to diverting amusements. We don't have any, do we? Economic questions. It's best to be very rich. Exemplary qualities of the English house. The English house is a product of English conditions.
It's one of the things which makes this book a little bit easier to read, despite it being so long, is that the bits which you don't want to read, you can get quite a good account of from.
Yeah, but also it's very it's a good toilet book, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can read little sections of it.
Yes.
Well, stop for a very long time.
Yeah. So let's do another one. Let's do wall.
1. The wall. Space as a combination of wall, ceiling and floor. Homely rooms. The design of the modern English room. The field of application in England. Technical considerations. Wooden partitions. Interior studwork. Plasterwork. Corners. Artistic treatment of the wall. Wall tapestries. Painting. Division of the wall. The frieze and the lower wall. Dado and the upper wall. Wooden panelled walls. Cupboards built into the panelling. Plastering the wall. The history of wallpaper. Morris's wallpaper. Wallpaper patterns after Morris. Textile patterns. Material for wall coverings. Leather wallpapers. Relief wallpapers. Decoration of the frieze. That's, how many pages is that? That is 10 pages out of 700, 800.
Yeah, well, we've got a slightly abridged version, so...
We do. Our one's missing a bit of the history.
Yeah.
It's missing about 400 pages of English history.
Yeah, they don't let you take the full one out of the library. I think that the description, particularly the second description, potentially makes it sound a little drier than it actually is, because the descriptions of these elements are really rich, and in particular they're kind of woven in with all of these close observations of behaviour, of like small differences in custom from Germany.
I feel a little bit like this. Who was it? It's one of the 19th century artists who said, "I've made a great discovery. I've discovered this amazing book on aphids," and it was like a 9-volume long history of aphids. And he says the man has got something very interesting to say about everything. And that's something that is basically impossible to get across, isn't it? Like, why this incredibly detailed taxonomic book discussing with sections on dado rails and the upper wall is really interesting. But he does have interesting things to say about all this stuff.
He does. And often when he talks about about like a room, like a dining room or whatever, he'll give a quite lively description of what dining is like in the kind of circles that he's moved in, and how it's different from people in his audience would be used to. He doesn't make it sound that good. It makes it sound quite boring. We're going to get onto some descriptions of that because they're quite funny. The other thing is that he often finds ways in which these peculiarities of English, like furniture or room design or whatever, come out of climate. And he has like a particular analysis of climate.
There's a lot of this like banging around at the time, isn't there? There's a lot of like Aristotelian meets sort of social Darwinism meets misty wreathed islands, you know, the sort of characteristics of the English that made them great, and the characteristics of the Teuton.
I think he gets one thing right, which is that although it doesn't rain that much more in England than anywhere else, it is quite damp, and it's mild. It's never very hot.
The main thing is it's not sunny.
Yes.
That's the quality. It never really dries out because it's not very sunny. And all of the things that make life civilized in sunny places aren't really possible here.
But there are also things which you can get away with. So you can have thin walls. You don't need to worry about having too much sun.
No, I think that's not really a big problem in our climate.
Yeah. And in fact, you can design the whole house really to maximize sun in the rooms which need it. So you can point the windows of the main living rooms like directly south if you want. You don't have to worry about having a kind of a balcony or a loggia or something which will provide a buffer space or some shade during the months of the summer. None of that needs to really be considered. But the thing which he really fixates on is the damp and the need for ventilation. And he has a theory for why all English houses are draughty, which is that, well, it comes down to the preference for having a big open fireplace in pretty much every room, no matter how small, and that the force of the updraft of using the fire sucks in air from all over the room through kind of gaps in around the door, through like gaps in the fabric, through gaps in the windows.
When I grew up, we did live for quite a while in a house that did have a large, not necessarily large, but a fireplace in every single room. And the draft would be so powerful that it would lift the carpets off the floor. Or you'd get this phenomenon where a sort of big bubble of air would build up and skitter, like they would sort of bubble up from a point and sort of skitter across the room. Which is like great force, and you'd go to the edge of the room and you'd feel this huge updraft of air. It was extraordinarily drafty. The enormous fireplace is a terrible, terrible idea. When lit, they actually make the room colder.
He is quite funny about this. So this is one of the points where this sort of quite dry, ironic humour comes through. He talks about how for the English, the fireplace has a sort of ethical significance. That to the English, to remove the fireplace from the home would be like removing the soul from the body. It's kind of like something monstrous about it.
He also says we sort of quite like it horrible and drafty and nasty. There was this weird, like Spartan sort of. People had sent their children off to boarding school to be sort of beaten and starved into becoming great men and characterful.
Yeah.
Muthesius,
I'm not sure if he necessarily believes it, but he does tell us that architects of the period thought that they could design where the drafts would go within the room. That they would sort of draw straight lines on the plan.
Less plausible. My experience of the English draft is it is everywhere.
So if you imagine the plan, you can kind of draw straight lines from the windows and the doors towards the fireplace, and then there are these like dead zones where Granny can like.
This is his theory of what the inglenook is as well, which is that you sit right next to the fireplace, but not in front of it, to the sides.
Yeah.
And the real reason you do that is because if you sit right in front of it, you get roasted alive.
Yeah.
But I think it's because he thinks there's no direct line from an opening to the fireplace. You're not breaking any of the draft.
Yeah,
lines.
Yeah, or if you have granny or like a vulnerable old person, you can also put them in this special armchair, which has been designed, which has I've never seen this. Apparently, it's closed at the top, kind of like a.
No, I've seen these. I've sat in these. It's definitely still a thing. Yeah. Often there's sort of all leather. He's not right about what they're for.
No, he says that they're a source of amusement in Germany, but in fact they're quite justified.
They are lovely. They are lovely. They're excellent for sleeping in because no one can see you.
His description of rooms also tells us quite a lot about culture. There are these quite interesting moments in the book where he, for instance, talks about how the different rooms in these big houses are gendered, like whether in the married couple of the husband and wife, like which rooms belong to who.
Oh yeah, he's got an excellent description of the boudoir.
Boudoir. So it's quite interesting. Like the bedroom belongs to the woman, and the man will go and undress and dress in like an adjoining room. And the woman may also like have sort of a desk and do some of her like, I don't know. Obviously, none of these people worked, so I don't really know what they do. But
spend ages and ages getting dressed, and then spend ages and ages getting dressed for dinner.
And then among the public rooms, there's the drawing room, sort of sitting room, morning room, are all female rooms, and kind of women's room. Women, like the women rule in those rooms. Like
so do their embroidery.
You have to kind of like play by their rules in those rooms. And then there are the male rooms, like the library, billiard room, smoking room, and to some extent the dining room are like the male spaces where they.
Do you think this is a little bit because in the 19th century German house, rooms are more explicitly gendered than they are in England, and he's having to explain how. I mean, literally in lots of German houses of this period, there would be a Herrenzimmer. There would be a man room.
A man room, yeah. I think that's part of it. I think that part of what's fascinating to him is like how universally understood but completely implicit it is.
Yeah, everyone knows you don't. You sort of behave very properly in a drawing room in a way that you wouldn't behave like at the pool table. Not the pool. I mean the billiard table. The men can hide in the library.
The men can play by, like, men's rules in the men rooms, but in the women rooms, they have to be polite. And they're probably not allowed... Well, they're certainly not allowed to be drunk.
Yeah. But also, women, sort of have to leave unless explicitly invited. Yeah. The dining room.
Yes. They have to go in case they see or hear something that would distress them.
All of this stuff, by the way, there's lots of literature. Yeah. If you like books, this stuff is minutely dissected in books.
The kind of the implicitness, I think, is also carried through into the way in which they're decorated. So women's rooms are light and men's rooms are dark, by and large. Like men's rooms are panelled,
dark and smoky.
They're dark, yeah. And then the women's rooms have probably got wallpaper, or they're probably light.
Wall fabrics.
Yeah, so as well as the list of the rooms, there's also a list of fittings and furniture, and this is the point at which the book actually starts to kind of resemble a catalogue almost. There are a
really obscure catalogue.
Yeah, but amazing. There are all these features of English rooms: tables, chairs, a lot of fireplaces. And they're represented as something culturally distinctive, but also undergoing rapid change and technological development. So in that sense, the portrait that he gives us of England is a little bit like the portrait that you often receive in a contemporary way about Japan. Sort of simultaneously distinctive, and loads of stuff is happening and is kind of constantly...
And also, in another subtler way, it's probably too early to suggest this, but as you brought up the Japan comparison, also really retrograde at the same time as being really high tech.
Yeah, both at the same time.
Like really retrograde.
Atavistic.
Yeah.
Yes, primitive.
And also maybe slightly... I think he's looking at this as there being a golden age of dynamism, but I also think he's slightly we're slightly past our best.
Yeah.
And about to hand the baton on to the Teuton.
So in the fireplaces section, for example, there are there's all the materials you can imagine. There are stone, cast iron, enamel, all different kinds of styles, and also none, like these very personal kind of ones by people like Leatherby. And then there are also kind of these. This is the catalogue-y bit. Is that there are these like fun hybrids where there's a fireplace with benches built into it around the sides, or like
rather
sort
as
of
the
folding
Japanese
around.
invented the calculator abacus, or the.
Yeah, I mean, what's your favourite part of this section? If you were going to pick something out of the catalogue.
There are obvious things like the custom-built, prefabricated cozy corner, so that you can have all your cozy and spontaneous details in one place.
Yeah, you can have a cozy corner in the middle of the field.
It also has bits that, like, are the biggest turn-offs in the book, aren't they? Where he goes on these long descriptions of, like, really obscure objects.
He has. I wonder how many of the illustrations he did himself or commissioned himself, because he has like these incredibly.
I think they're from catalogues.
Like, there's no relationship between the status of the object and how lavish the illustration is, and there's quite often like,
or like no relation between how interesting or obscure the object
Yeah.
is and how much he writes about it.
sink with integrated like drain for washing meat or something, and it's it's illustrated in the same level of detail as the overhead perspective of a stately home.
Yeah, like, which is a really great level of detail.
Yeah, it's
like,
really
all
fun.
Really
it's
lovely.
really fun. There's no filter though. That's kind of what's amazing about it.
Yeah, I mean, who did this drawing? Like, how long do you think that drawing of the meat rotator took?
I don't know. I imagine like 2-3 days.
3 days, yeah, of like this like clockwork meat rotator. Which is it's basically just something that turns things round.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I've been trying to scan some of these before I give the book back, and I will put these up on the website when we have one, because I think that they really add to the fun, and it's very distinctive. Not necessarily the images on their own, but the mixture of them that you have.
Yeah,
I
and
don't
also
think there's any other book that has this like weird mixture of all of these different things.
Yeah, it's he's got some niche interests, but it's also a period when lots of books with niche interests. If you want to stare into the sort of psyche, buy yard books of particular periods. It's quite good, because it's all the stuff that like we are no longer interested in, but they were interested in then. So there's lots of them. And in this period, in addition to the yards and yards of like fishing guides and weird racist histories and stuff, and ripping yarns, there are lots of weird encyclopedic, detailed sort of. A lot of the books that were sold were books imparting detailed technical information on subjects, which could be incredibly varied. Yeah. There wasn't the internet. No. If you were like nerdily into something, you bought a book.
The internet came in like 8 volumes. Do you think he was a good spy? I mean, so he's not really a spy apparently, but
he sort of was a spy, but not like. But the information he was imparting was completely useless. But he was very good at it.
Yeah.
It's just that he sort of ended up with a sketch that's kind of slightly Woody Allen neurotic, rather than a number of English real neuroses. Yeah. Rather than... They're like psychological weak points in the sense of the things that cause them embarrassment.
They're not necessarily militarily useful.
Confiscate their fireplaces. Always invade at 11:10 and 3:15. Stuff them full of fancy continental cooking. Their digestive tracts will not handle it.
And so, I mean, actually, a big part of the pleasure of the book is Muthesius's kind of cultural diagnosis of the English.
Oh yeah. He's talking about like drawing rooms, and then suddenly there's this weird psychological sketch of some aspect of English life.
That's what's quite fun,
which is almost invariably a character assassination. Actually,
but
disguised as like being very positive. No, it's a character assassination.
Yeah, it's quite funny. So what you'll read, like the drawing room, or what happens in the drawing room, the dining room, and then he'll have a bit on English cooking. Yeah, I mean, we could start at the beginning. So, like, the big observations that he has are that the English are very practical, by which he means that they design the type of house that they want to live in, rather than one which just sort of looks grand.
They want to show off.
Yeah,
which isn't actually true.
It's completely untrue. It's completely untrue if you look at the houses he actually recommends. They're incredibly showy-offy. He also highlights what he calls their individuality, which I think is purely a post-rationalisation of the preference for living in houses rather than flats, which is kind of universal, and the suspicion and lack of interest in cities.
And probably a bit of English aristocratic eccentricity, which he doesn't talk about very much, but I'm sure he witnessed a great deal of.
Yeah. So he refers to the desolate monotony of English cities, which is...
Yeah, and also there is only one English city, which is just made of villages. which is London, and the rest of it really. Well, I mean, he probably looked when he was like looking at the like gas processing plants that he was meant to be writing at. He probably did go to other cities, but you wouldn't know it.
He sends no word of Bradford. Here's a quotation about the English and their cities. The hubbub of the metropolitan streets, a visit to a beer keller or cafe, are almost hateful to them.
Yeah. We don't like each other. No. Well, I'm currently reading Diary of a Nobody. It's a fantastic study of It's the best study of 19th century suburban life as a sort of satire. Yeah. You have to know it's an in-joke and that he's taking the piss out of everything, but it's all sort of. I mean, it's a like diary studded with jokes about him doing a bad pun, and then I roared, and my wife roared too. We laughed so much we couldn't, and it's but it also exhibits this stuff too. He lives at the Laurels, Brickfield Terrace, Holloway, in a nice 6-room residence, not counting the basement, with a front breakfast parlour. You must understand this house is much less grand than the ones that we are sort of dealing with. After my work at the city, I like to be at home. What is the good of a home if you're never in it? Home sweet home, that's my motto. I'm always in of an evening. Our good friend Going may drop over without ceremony. Also, so may Cummings, who lives opposite. My dear wife Caroline is very pleased to see them, if they like to drop in on us, but Carrie and I can manage to pass our evenings together without friends. Blah, blah, blah. There's lots of good bits, but there's sort of... It's the trouble with quoting from this book is it's sort of about how boring he is.
Yeah, no, the picture which Muthesius gives is of like an intensely boring society where they do all of their leisure and socialising at home. He has like this weird rationalisation for it, which I think is entirely mystical and nonsensical, about how the English like to remain in touch with nature. But the fact is that even, as we've heard from the Grossmith quote, like even among people who were living right in the city, in like these like big terraces or semi-detached houses where there is no nature, they still live in this incredibly kind of like cloistered and
but what they do have, which he doesn't sort of note on, is an awful lot of like naff faddy interests.
Yeah.
Like, the book has got a great deal of satires of fads, but I mean, even on the front page, she's learning the Sylvia Garot on the 3-year system. Gavotte on the 3-year system.
What does that mean?
That's like Suzuki method
for dancing.
For piano playing.
Oh, okay.
It's all this sort of, they're perpetually sending things away, and he's like complaining that she's taken to the fad of writing with white ink on black paper her letters.
Oh wow!
And all that sort of stuff. It's like all these like awful. If you read contemporary descriptions of the time, terrible taste. The English were singled out by their atrocious taste.
Yeah, very bad taste. It's telling that although they by preference spend all of their time at home and do all of their socialising in like a domestic context, they're not terribly good at any of the things that they would be good at. So the food, by his account, is at best very basic. Should we have the quotation?
Oh no, it's fantastic. English cooking is extremely simple, almost primitive. English cooking is the most artless, the most uncultivated cooking in the world. They endure and indeed desire the greatest monotony.
So he says that they roast all of their meats on the fire. There are no sauces. There are no dishes with 2 or more ingredients. They boil all the vegetables for 2 hours
or longer. Yeah. I mean,
there's even
this kind of style of cooking was limping on into our youth. I think.
Yeah, I think so. Like,
did you go to a school that gave you lunches?
Yes.
There was that had any pretensions?
No pretensions. No.
Grey. Oh, was it sort of hash browns?
It was like weird pizza and stuff. Yeah. I think it was things that had arrived in a plastic bag.
Oh no, that's sad. It had died in your local neck of the woods, but it was still sort of. But yeah, there's a great description of the use of certain piquant sauces, such as the Worcestershire sauce.
Yes, Worcester sauce.
Which they are most proud.
Worcester sauce is the high point of English culinary excellence.
Crack out the old Liam Perrins.
They also don't drink, which I think is rather disappointing. He said,
I mean, we drink now.
Yeah. He says, it used to be the custom to remove the table before dessert and then embark on a drinking bout that not infrequently ended in the whole company being drunk. But no longer, so that now men of the era he describes have all become extremely temperate. He said they've all become fit for the drawing room, which I think is like a real mark of
that's like there's not going to be any racy language or discussion of God or drains.
No, they smoke a cigar and then go and join the ladies.
What do you think the ladies are talking about? Have you read the Nancy Mitford books?
No.
There's like all this sort of mad sexual stuff going on. And then there's like long descriptions of all the wonders she can do with embroidery and the like new chair covers. These people who are supremely rich don't have to do anything and consequently fill their lives with completely boring work.
So the story of the influence of this book is very different in Germany from the realm, which is England.
I think it's easy to talk about the influence of it in England,
which is basically zero. It
wasn't translated into English until the late 80s.
No, 70s, late 70s.
Late 70s.
Yeah.
Okay, it wasn't translated to England in the late 70s. I'm not sure people were that interested in it in the late 70s.
Yeah.
And it is struggling to break through the 2 millionth mark on the Amazon book ranking.
But in Germany, it was very, very successful, and you can see this if you want to buy it second hand. German copies are very cheap because there are lots of them.
Yeah.
And English copies, even the quite heavily abridged version, are really quite expensive. There are not very many of them around.
Yeah, like a proper English translation goes for a couple of £100.
Yeah, yeah.
Of an out of copyright German book that nobody cares about.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to think about why was it forgotten so quickly in England, and it's partly that.
It was never noticed in England. Why wasn't it translated is perhaps the question.
Well, I think that there was quite a small window for it to be translated in before people actually stopped being interested in the kind of architecture that it described.
And most of that window was not very pro-German.
Yeah.
I mean, we were sort of running up to having a war with them.
Yeah.
And then they might be the Bosch after that.
Yeah, I think that it might have made it. But then after the First World War, I guess people were starting to get interested in modernism, and really this whole kind of approach of
I think actually this stuff is completely dominant in the UK until the mid-1930s.
You think? I think everything goes much back towards sort of neoclassicism again. I mean, there are still people who are building a bit like this. There's like Voisey and CFA Voisey and Edwin Lutyens who are going on, but
Letherby and others. I think.
Yeah. But actually, the current of architectural style goes first back towards a sort of bombastic, like highly imperial sort of neoclassicism with people like Herbert Baker, who's building all sorts of appalling Portland stone buildings all over the place, including in quite a lot of other.
I love it when it gets a bit more pimped. If you go to the West End, when you go inside, a lot of like weird marble and architectural textiles.
It goes, I think probably like the 1910s to the 1930s in England is some of the worst building ever built.
There's a really good, in the modernism exhibition, there was a really good, it was just this wonderful interior of the period.
Yeah.
With its weird carpet, weird taxidermy.
Yeah.
And there was just a big red, no sign on it.
And then when modernism comes around, England gets into modernism quite late in the day.
Really late. It's the mid-30s.
As a consequence, many of the people who had become major movers and are founder institutors of the international style of modernism, like Walter Gropius, had definitely read this book and were into it, but they'd stopped being into it by the time people in Britain kind of got round to being interested. But why should people be interested in it now is a question. What case would we make for it as a subject of interest?
It teaches you how to do some lovely stuff with houses. It teaches you to think about how people use rooms in a deep and meaningful way. It tells you a bit about the English character, and it's funny. And it also is a way into some of the most impenetrable and untalked about but still interesting periods of European architecture, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's awesome stuff. Buy this book. Let's see if we can get through the 1,000,000 mark.
Yeah, buy it. Buy it.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Yeah, we finished. What's the time?